Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
This is episode 6 in the Microplastics series, which is covering current regulatory efforts. If you missed it, the prior episode covered health risk and current human health toxicology. I want to welcome our presenter today, who is Byron Brown from the law firm Crowell and Mooring. Byron, could you please give us a little bit about your background?
Sure, Leland. And thanks for inviting me to participate in today's podcast. As Leland said, my name is Byron Brown. I'm a senior counsel with the law firm Crowell and Mooring, based in Washington, D.C. I've been at the firm for about 4 years now, and I focus on public policy issues, primarily in the environment space. I work in both the government affairs and the environment practice groups at the firm. I spent a number of years on Capitol Hill, including a time on the Senate Environment Committee where I worked on the waste and recycling portfolio. I've also spent a number of years at EPA as both a career attorney in the Office of General Counsel and more recently as an appointee in the Administrator's Office, where I served as Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and spent a lot of my time thinking about infrastructure issues. So happy to be here today and talk about microplastics in the environment and one of the contributing factors, the lack of recycling infrastructure, and also some of the public policy responses happening at the federal, state, and international level to address the issue.
We are very glad to have you today, Byron, and your background on both the kind of regulatory and legislative sides is definitely very insightful, I think, for what we're talking about. One question we've been asking kind of throughout this series is, what are microplastics? When I say microplastics, what do you think of?
So that's an interesting question. I grew up in a coastal area in New England, and I spent a lot of time going to the beach as a kid and used to always pick up little pieces of beach glass, glass that was maybe from a broken bottle that over time had this washed, aged patina look to it, and you would collect it, and it would have, different colors, and, it was always sort of a neat souvenir from the beach. But over the years, you would find less and less beach glass, and you would find little bits of plastic on the beach instead. And so that's probably the thing that pops into my mind initially is little pieces of plastic, but also, just plastic bottles and things that would wash up on the beach. But more recently, I'm probably also thinking of microplastics in terms of like the dryer lint that I pull out of my clothes drying machine. And, the past few years I've become more aware of how big part of the microplastic issue is really microfibers sloughing off of clothes that have, artificial fabrics in them, and how those microfibers make their way through laundry machines and often out into the environment through the washing process. So I guess I'm thinking about it both as a nostalgic kid, but also sort of a practical homeowner these days.
Well, it sounds like there's lots to be thinking about. So are there regulations that are starting to look into those various concerns with microplastics?
So I think it's important to take a step back and think about how microplastics are getting into the environment and, what's contributing to the public concern about the amount of microplastics and how they're becoming ubiquitous throughout not just oceans and water media, but they're really everywhere throughout the world. You're finding microplastics in Arctic areas, on top of mountains, in the bottom of the ocean. So they're really everywhere. I think it's helpful to take a step back and ask, how are they getting into the environment? Some of it is certainly through the manufacturing process where plastics are being manufactured and there might be an improper release of plastic pellets into a water body, and those, get released into the environment. But it's often coming from products that are not properly managed on, once their life cycle is ended. So think about single-use plastics that are discarded rather than, recycled. Or in the case of a lot of marine debris issues, you're talking about fishing tackle that gets abandoned at sea or gets broken off, from a fishing ship, and plastic bags that are getting washed out into a waterway in Southeast Asia, sort of making their way into the oceans, and over time, the plastic is breaking down and becomes the little micro pieces of the plastic that we're focused on. I think there's a number of existing, at least in the U.S., a number of existing federal laws that govern, the manufacture of, chemicals and industrial products. And, I would say the tools like the Clean Water Act, they exist and they have, robust regulatory requirements. There's enforcement mechanisms for both EPA and states and citizens to enforce those requirements. So my personal view is that, those authorities are probably sufficient to deal with the instances where you have a factory, making plastics, releasing plastic pellets, into the environment. But where I think there probably is the view that the regulatory scheme is inadequate is when you're dealing with, recycling infrastructure and what to do with, plastic products once they're out into the world being used by consumers and what happens to them at the end of their life cycle.
So it sounds like kind of the downstream and end of life really matters here. Even if you have really good regulations, you still have to do something with all of those plastics. And maybe looking at a different, country like China, for example, I mean, it seems like maybe they used to recycle a lot of plastics. And then I think there was a recent ban on imports of waste and recyclables by China. What impact has that had on microplastics?
In 2018, a ban went into effect, where China basically stopped importing a number of recyclables. Plastics were one of the ones caught up in the ban, and it partly had to do with how plastics from the U.S. were being prepared for export to China, that they were often, dirty and required a lot of processing on the back end once they reached China. And China decided to halt imports, in part because they were generating a lot of their own plastic and needed to find ways to address their own domestic recycling problems. And so they decided to stop accepting plastics from the West. That led to a couple of things. Sort of for a period of time, you would see West Coast export locations stockpiling plastics because there was no international market for them. You saw an increase in plastics being landfilled. A lot of plastics destined for the export market would end up in other Asian countries, specifically in Southeast Asia, which are known to have major problems, managing their waste, and their main sources of marine debris issues. But I would say domestically, the thing that it highlighted is the fact that the U.S. doesn't really have an effective means to manage its plastic waste, plastic byproducts, however you want to talk about it. The reason for that is the U.S. historically has managed solid waste and recyclable materials at the state and local level. It's not really a federal concern, and the legal authorities around management of recycled materials is pretty limited. EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has some authority to manage or to provide funding to states and local governments to help them manage recycling programs. But it's not like EPA is overseeing a national recycling program. And I'm not saying that is something EPA should be doing. and, is necessary, but there's not really any kind of comprehensive national scheme for managing these sorts of products, and the ban on Chinese imports really highlighted that sort of breakdown and how plastics especially are managed. Just for some context, the number of plastic bottles that are created in the country and discarded is pretty significant. But there's only, maybe 10% of plastic containers are actually recycled. So there's a lot of plastics that are going to landfills or, just being discarded, outside of a collection system. So there's definitely room for growth in that area.
So it seems like the federal government, probably historically has a lot of power to regulate, whether you're talking the Clean Water Act or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. But you're saying those really aren't up to the task of addressing this new issue of microplastics.
I'm not sure if I would say they're up to the task or not. I guess I would say those laws serve a different purpose, and what you're seeing these days is the growth of plastics and the plastic industry in the U.S. has really taken off in the past couple of decades, and a lot of that is attributed to the growth of the petrochemical sector and the growth of natural gas in the U.S. And you have the U.S. becoming a leading producer of both petroleum and natural gas globally, and that has led to the reshoring of a lot of petrochemical facilities in the U.S. And so you do see a lot of petrochemical facilities being located in areas where there's good access to natural gas, and there's pipelines, and there's export opportunities globally. And those are heavily regulated industries, as I was saying before. But what you're also seeing is a growth of plastic consumer products and household products, and plastic being used for beverage containers and food containers and utensils for takeaway, restaurants. And with COVID, you've seen, just how important plastics are in the healthcare industry. We wouldn't really be able to have responded to COVID as well as we did without medical intervention, and a lot of that came in the form of personal protective equipment that's manufactured with plastics, or other medical equipment that is, sterilized, but then it's packaged in plastics. And once those plastics are used, they're all considered single-use plastics. It's just, how are they going to be managed? And so what you're starting to see as a policy response, questions about whether the current regulatory system is adequate to manage the amount and diversity of plastics that are being produced globally, but certainly in the U.S., and a particular concern about single-use plastics. And I think there's a recognition that some single-use plastics are incredibly valuable, and we should not be doing anything to limit their production or use. But there's other single-use plastics that have gotten a lot of attention, and there's a lot of concern about whether they are, on balance, beneficial to human health and the environment. When you're talking about plastics being used to protect food, a lot of important human health concerns related to, food spoiling and preserving food as long as possible and avoiding food waste. And those are, really important concerns environmentally as well. And so, you need to find a way to balance the use of plastics and helping to protect food, for example, versus sort of some of the other environmental concerns that might result from the plastic. So policymakers are really struggling with this. You see states like California being at maybe the forefront of efforts to regulate single-use plastics, and California just passed a law that would ban a number of single-use plastics, especially like food and beverage containers. There have been across the country a number of bans on plastic bags and plastic containers used for takeout and to-go food. You see municipalities enacting bans on straws at restaurants. So you see all of these different experiments happening across the country, and I would say that's a good thing, and it helps inform policymakers at the federal level. And if there is a gap in the law, I think the best thing for the policymakers to do is to look around at what's happening at the state and local level and see what's working and see what's not working, and see if there's something that could be done within the constitutional framework that we have to respond. But I don't want to suggest that, there's no environmental regulation of plastics or, even a plastic recycling, because that's not the case. It just happens through our system of, multiple layers of government being involved.
So it sounds like the federal government hasn't really done much yet to directly address microplastics, and maybe the states are kind of stepping up and taking things into their hands. Have you seen other ways where microplastics have been regulated? Are there activist groups that are attempting to regulate it, or are there judicial activism or lawsuits or things like that have been filed trying to address this issue?
Just stepping back, I would say Congress has responded to the issue in some limited ways. A couple of years ago, one of the major areas of concern was microplastic beads in cosmetic products and facial scrubs and things like that. And so those microbeads were making their way into domestic wastewater and out to wastewater treatment plants, and there really wasn't an adequate way to remove those from wastewater. And so Congress did respond with a ban on microbeads in cosmetic products. And that ban has gone into effect and has been working for a number of years. So you do have Congress trying to step in and address discrete issues. What Congress has not been willing or interested in doing is doing a wholesale revision to how waste is managed in the country. You're not seeing bans on single-use plastics. You're not seeing other regimes like extended producer responsibility requirements, or things that would require industry to pay for the setup and collection of plastic recycling infrastructure. That said, there are bills out there that would do that, and there's a piece of legislation that's been pending in both the House and the Senate called the Break Free from Plastic Act, sponsored by Senator Udall and Representative Leland in the House. And they're very popular among Democrats in Congress, but I don't think that those sorts of comprehensive pieces of legislation are really going to gain much traction. Instead, what you see getting traction and getting enacted into law are smaller pieces of legislation that really focus on the lack of recycling infrastructure. You saw that with the passage of the infrastructure law. There were several provisions dealing with recycling, and specifically recycling of like household materials that that would include plastics. And EPA has received several $100 million under the infrastructure law to provide grants to states and local governments to bolster their recycling efforts for plastics and other household waste materials. But again, you're not seeing major pieces of legislation that coming out of Congress that would regulate plastics or recycling. The other example of legislation that has passed in recent years is the Save Our Seas Act. There's an initial version, and then there was a secondary one passed in 2020, and those in marine areas and provide additional funding to address sources of marine pollution and marine debris issues. Again, things like fishing tackle that gets lost at sea, or countries that don't have adequate infrastructure to stop plastic from getting washed out to sea. So there's, funding support for that. What I think is interesting is you are seeing the NGO community step up, and they are filing lawsuits against both plastic producers So I've seen Clean Water Act citizen suits against companies that manufacture thermoplastic, pellets that get released into a water body, and those seem to be, successful. I've also seen instances where the NGO community is trying to go after the oil and gas industry that's providing the inputs into the petrochemical industry and the plastic industry. So you're seeing sort of a multifaceted attack on plastics through sort of the NGO world, and kind of a mixed bag of how effective they'll be in the long term. You're also starting to see companies step up and try to address the issue through non-regulatory means. There's a major initiative by a number of household product companies in the chemical industry partnering with NGOs to address marine debris issues globally. You've also seen a number of companies make pledges to incorporate plastics, to prioritize recycling of plastics, and beverage companies in particular are focused on that. So I think there's a range of government action that can be impactful, plus the role of the NGO community stepping in, but also the private sector responding to consumer demands, as well as pressure from regulators and activists.
So it sounds like there's kind of a growing patchwork of risk and regulations, and maybe even some potential opportunities for companies in this space. What should companies be thinking about, and how should they be assessing what to do next in this space?
That, I think, is a really important question. And I think being able to look ahead and, see where some of these environmental issues are going is really important. There's a lot of focus on ESG issues right now. And I would say the plastic issue touches on, both the E, the S, and the G, the environment, the social, and the governance aspects of the ESG equation. And, so I think it's important for companies and, manufacturers to think about it holistically. What are they doing in terms of, making their products easier to recycle? There's a lot of focus right now, and some of this is being driven by California and private lawsuits that are targeting recycling claims. If a product is being advertised as being recyclable, is it in fact recyclable, or are there parts of a plastic bottle that are not recyclable? And if you are a company that is selling natural food products, does the food contain microfibers of plastic? Whether it's fish or like a bottled water, or something like beer, some sort of product that might have picked up microfibers through the processing of it. There's going to be, I think, increasing scrutiny over, marketing claims about, healthy products or natural products, and what are the risks that a company faces if they're making those claims, but the products end up containing, microplastics. And, there's been some research documenting the prevalence of microplastics in, seafood and shellfish, but also other consumer products, water, beer, honey, manufactured food products as well. And I think that's a growth area that companies need to sort of get their head around, is, what are they saying about their products from an environmental standpoint, and from a recycling and recyclability standpoint, and how are their products contributing to a circular economy, or, their manufacturing processes contributing to a circular economy. And one of the other external pressure points that you're seeing is efforts by the federal government in a non-regulatory sense, but the federal government is updating its federal purchasing requirements to promote more sustainable products. And the General Services Administration just a couple of weeks ago issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking asking government contractors to provide information about how plastic packaging and shipping material could be changed to make it more environmentally beneficial, but also asking government contractors for their thoughts on a ban on single-use plastics as part of the federal procurement process. If you're in the government contracting space, you certainly should be aware of the administration's focus on sustainability generally, but also how that focus is impacting plastics generally and the potential for plastics to be recycled or even banned outright in some situations.
So it sounds like there is a whole lot to think about regarding regulations for microplastics, both at the state level, at the federal level, and globally. If you had to kind of narrow it down, what are the main things you would want the audience to take away from this discussion?
I think the main thing to take away is not to be complacent. There is a lot happening at the federal level, at the state level, at local levels, and internationally. One of the big things happening that we haven't even talked about is the United Nations Environment Program is convening work on a new plastics treaty. And that certainly will have implications for microplastics in the environment. And, the U.S. government is actively engaged in those discussions. And I think, if you're in this space, you need to understand what's happening as part of that process, as well as what's happening in your own backyard and your own community when it comes to, plastics and recycling.
Well, again, definitely a lot to be thinking about. Thank you very much, Byron, for talking with us today, and to the ABA for hosting. The next episode will cover near-term and future potential regulatory efforts, so be sure to tune in. Thanks again, Byron.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/environ. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.